Greetings. Welcome to Dr. English's Book Lovers Book Club. I'm Dr. English and I teach English. This week I'm going to review Looking for Alaska by John Green. And last week I said I was going to revisit it, and I realized I have not read this. That I had read The Fault in Our Stars, which I really loved, and I really admire John Green's writing. And I had a graduate student who included some of his books in her thesis on sexuality in young adult fiction and why it should be taught and why students need to have opportunities for that. It was just very well written. So shout out to Brittany. Um, I just really love this book. I know last week I was talking about a very wide expanse of sea, and I kind of struggled. And this really just kept my attention because Miles is like, he's a character who I immediately liked because he remembers the last words of famous people. And I just thought how interesting that he did such a thing. And I think too, I didn't know that John Green had gone to a boarding school in Alabama. That kind of surprised me a little bit. And so I wonder how much of it is autobiographical, but also that I always read everything in the book. And so I read the notes and the acknowledgments and how he was encouraged to write this book. And I'm so glad he did, because I just absolutely fell in love with Miles, and I fell in love with the Colonel. The Colonel is like, maybe it's really, he's quirky, but there have been people in my life that are so much like the Colonel, who are just like, just so smart. He was so smart. And, so what I would just say is just like neurotic and, OCD. Like, he has to find these answers, and he's just meticulous about it. And so I really love it. And I love how they're just trying to, and especially for Miles, navigate this new experience and wanting to get away from his parents in Florida, and then meeting Alaska. And it just struck me as really interesting that I thought it was a really obscure reference to Gabriel Garcia Marquez and The General and His Labyrinth, because I've read that and it's not my favorite Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I'm like, I have to go back and reread that, because I remember reading it and thinking, I'm struggling with this, because I love 100 Years of Solitude, and I loved Living the Time of Cholera, and I struggled with The General and His Labyrinth. So it was interesting to me that that was the focus for Alaska, the last words of Simon Bolivar. I'm not sure those were them, but I'd have to look that up, about how do I ever get out of this labyrinth. So from my perspective, I think John Green does it so well, uh, as far as how he develops the characters. It's just, he's so masterful at, you just really feel like you're right there cheering on, Chip. Chip is the Colonel's real name, and Miles and Alaska through all of their escapades. And it gives you kind of a window into, like, what does go on. And I know it's probably it might be a stereotype, but I think it's true of public schools, but I think in boarding schools are really just in their own kind of space, and with their own kinds of challenges. And so I really appreciated, and the smoking, it was just like, I don't, I'm kind of like my grad student, that the sexuality part I think is normal for teenagers, but the smoking just kind of got to me. It was like, oh my gosh, it's just like an obsession. But uh, I also understand why people did it, do it, so it's just like, it does calm people's nerves. So I appreciated that it was so realistic in so many ways about teenagers. And I just, there's so many pieces in this that I really wanted to read, but I don't want spoilers. But one thing that I will say about someone like me, I'm kind of a seasoned reader, and I saw how it was structured before and after, and I pretty much predicted what was going to happen. There were a couple of times when I thought, oh, I must be wrong, and then I was not, and I was like, oh, so it's hard for me. I love to read, but I also am someone who grew up reading Nancy Drew, like everything on the shelf in the library in a small town in Nebraska. And I've figured out some of those things pretty quickly. Uh, so, um, uh, but I still have the question, that Miles and the Colonel have about Alaska. And so, but I kind of had a feeling about, just, pretty quickly in the, and of course, I probably, I just noticed that right away. What is before? And then I'm like, what do they mean? What are they talking about before? So I said, there has to be an after. And so in that regard, if you're a seasoned reader, you might pick up on those things pretty quickly. Um, and I didn't think that John Green did a lot of foreshadowing, um, but I had an idea, and I don't want to spoil it, so I'm not going to say anything. And some of you may have already read this, but if some of you may have not, so I don't want to give any spoilers. But I just really want to, commend John Green for his absolutely stellar kind of, how he, really makes the characters come to life, that you just want to be there for them. And they're just so authentic and real. And that's not easy to do, into at an emotional level, that I got involved with this story. I had to keep reading. So I lost some sleep reading this because I just couldn't put it down. And that's really quite a compliment coming from me. And the plot is, I mean, it's great. I mean, it's like there's an arc to the story. And I also figured out the why about what happens. I figured that out pretty quickly. It was hidden from not Charlie. I've got Perks of Being a Wallflower in my mind. Sometimes the characters all kind of run together, but from Miles and the Colonel. But I had a pretty good idea of why, what, as far as what happened. And so, um, as that was something that they were struggling with. I feel like I'm going on and on, but it's such a good book. The characters you will just love them immediately. And I'm going to read a couple of excerpts from here. They're kind of short, but only because I don't want to give things away to those who haven't read it. Hold on, I said. I went into Dad's study and found his biography of Francois Rabelais. I liked reading biographies of writers, even if, as was the case with Monsieur Rabelais, I'd never read any of their actual writing. I flipped to the back and found the highlighted quote. Never use a highlighter in my books, my dad had told me 1,000 times. But how are you supposed to find what you're looking for? So this guy, I said, standing in the doorway of the living room, Francois Rabelais, he was this poet, and his last words were, I go to seek a great perhaps. That's why I'm going, so I don't have to wait until I die to start seeking a great perhaps. And that quieted them. I was after a great perhaps, and they knew as well as I did that I wasn't going to find it with the likes of Will and Marie. I sat back down on the couch between my mom and my dad, and my dad put his arm around me, and we stayed there like that, quiet on the couch together, for a long time, until it seemed okay to turn on the TV. And then we ate artichoke dip for dinner and watched the History Channel. And as going away parties go, it certainly could have been worse. So you start out knowing that Miles is going to Culver Creek in Alabama, because he's seeking the great perhaps. And as an English professor, how can you not love that? It's like that's what we're all trying to do, is find the great perhaps. And then this other quote comes almost about halfway through. And this is the page that we know that Alaska's name, her last name is Young. And he starts off, he says, it's not life or death, the labyrinth. Okay, so what is it? Suffering, she said. This is Alaska speaking. Doing wrong and having wrong things happen to you. That's the problem. Bolivar was talking about the pain, not about the living or dying. How do you get out of the labyrinth of suffering? What's wrong? I asked. And I felt the absence of her hand on me. Nothing's wrong, but there's always suffering, Pudge. Homework or malaria or having a boyfriend who lives far away when there's a good-looking boy lying next to you. Suffering is universal. It's the one thing Buddhists, Christians, and Muslims are all worried about. I turned to her. Oh, so maybe Dr. Hyde's class isn't total bullshit? And both of us lying on our sides, she smiled, our noses almost touching, my unblinking eyes on hers, her face blushing from the wine. And I opened my mouth again, but this time not to speak. And she reached up and put a finger to my lips and said, shh, shh, don't ruin it. And so they had been in a class with Dr. Hyde. It was a religion class, and he asked them to come up with their own question about religion and so she of course alluded to Gabriel Garcia Marquez's the general in his labyrinth, and I just really love that passage. There's so many good ones, but that was one of my favorites. So I do highly recommend this book. I think I'm going to do my spiel for English educators or anybody who's teaching a book uh, in a secondary English ed class or middle school. I think this you could teach it in middle school. It's got some things that you could probably, you know, it's not it's not really explicit in any way. I don't think. Definitely, I think you could teach this in high school. I think it's just wonderfully well done. I mean, people used to read, like I said, Catcher in the Rye, and I feel like this is a book that definitely could be taught in high school. I definitely think you could do this as a book club or a novel panel or a literature circle, and have it on your shelf, and you'll know your students, and encourage them to read it. But just the thought of like teaching a book by John Green in a whole class for that common experience and that discussion of the things that happen, you just it's just something you can't beat. Of course, the book clubs you can do that too, but it's still a smaller group, not as many perspectives as if you did a whole class reading of this novel. So I highly recommend this. I think everyone should read all John Green's novels, and I say that with deep sincerity. He's such a good writer. So um, next week, I'm going to be reviewing another book that came from my class on young adult literature, and that is Salt to the Sea by Ruta Sepetys. And I've actually read this twice because I read it, I think, last year or the year before, and I wanted to reread it, and it was a pleasure to go back through and reread it to understand. There's four main characters, and there's four points of view in this, and Ruta does a very good job of that, keeping the storyline going from four different perspectives. So I will see you next week, and I'm going to review Salt to the Sea. Thanks for joining me. Bye.